Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Section 4 of our Criminology course, where we're going to be talking today about psychological theories of crime. All right? And of course, we can't talk about psychological theories of crime without talking about the big man himself, Sigmund Freud, the father of modern psychology, and a man who did enough cocaine to kill 3 horses. This man made Charlie Sheen look like a lightweight. Okay? Now, he came up with this idea of there being kind of 3 parts of the human brain. They're the id, the ego, and the superego. All right? The id is kind of your instincts. You're kind of, what a lot of modern people refer to as the lizard brain, the non-conscious instinct, right? The ego is your conscious mind. This is what you're actually thinking about, right? This is the little voice in your head that you use to, actually think with, right? And then the superego is your conscience, right? It's the little cricket on your shoulder that says, "Oh, don't do that. That's bad." Or, "Oh, you should help that poor person out because they need you," or, whatever. That conscience is the superego. And as Freud saw it, children go through this developmental cycle where each one of these 3 is kind of dominant at different stages, and they're just getting developed at these different stages. And up until the age of 3, your id is clearly the dominant force, and then kind of your ego gets developed, and then at some later age your superego gets developed, and all these things. And children go through this developmental process, and there's a whole thing with, the anal stage and the genital stage, and it's a whole weird. I highly recommend reading up on it because it is really, really, really interesting in a kind of watching a train wreck kind of way. But according to Freud, it is problems or kind of screw ups in this developmental process that create abnormal personalities in adults, right? So if you have some problem, some psychological issue as an adult, it's because there was some issue or some something didn't happen or happened wrong in these stages of child development, and when you were supposed to be doing this piece, you instead did this other thing, right? And you have guilt about some factor involved in that childhood growth process. And it's that unresolved guilt from this childhood something or other that causes all of these abnormal psychological issues later on in life. Now, this is mostly kind of rejected at this point. Freud is just seen as the incredibly coked up individual he was. But he started thinking about psychotherapy and psychology and all those things in different ways, and it's that kind of change and way to view psychology that we remember him for, not his specific ideas or specific conclusions, right? So in the more modern time, instead of looking at kind of the id, the ego, and the superego, one of the more dominant psychological theories of criminality is personality theory. Personality theory says that different people have different high or low levels of different personality traits. Everything from aggression to impulsiveness to conformity to, all these different factors, compassion and loving kindness and all these different things. Everybody either has high levels of each of those or low levels of each of those. And if we know people's personality traits and what they're high and low in, we can kind of predict or those personalities might even be the cause of criminality. And the good news is we have a slightly more scientific way to measure these personality traits. There are a few of which, but the most common is called the MMPI, the something multiple personality inventory. And it's this huge, giant, long, kind of multiple choice test. It's like 500 questions or something ridiculous. Takes hours to complete the full version. But you sit down, you answer all these hundreds of multiple choice tests, and depending on the answers you pick, they can measure, ostensibly, these personality traits, whether you're high or low in compassion, whether you're high or low in aggressiveness, etc., etc. And the belief there is we can kind of predict or measure somebody's criminality by measuring what personality traits they score high and low in, right? And there's some research that says that there are some personality traits that are very distinctly and strongly linked to criminality. On the other hand, there's research showing that there's really not a lot of these personality traits that are linked to criminality. And one of the big problems with this measurement is that there's a tautology involved in the measurement itself. So, in essence, a lot of the questions on the MMPI are questions about criminal or deviant acts. Like, have you ever punched somebody when you got angry at them? Or, you know, do you feel the desire to take things that aren't yours? And, you know, a lot of the questions are either directly or indirectly about crime or deviance. So we're using the person's criminal actions or deviant actions to predict their criminal or deviant actions in a lot of cases, at least partially. So of course we're going to find at least some amount of consistency there. We're going to find some correlation there because our independent variable is being measured using our dependent variable, at least in part. That's a tautology, right? So we can't really use those questions to try to predict criminality because it's just circular, right? So they've tried to develop similar personality inventories where the questions don't have to do with crime or deviance. And those show a little bit better correlation with criminality. But it's still rather inconsistent, right? Now, probably the most famous connection between psychology and criminality is the concept of the psychopath, right? Movies and TV shows have been using this concept of psychopathy since movies and TV shows have been a thing. And, you know, and the big driver of this theory of psychopathy in modern times is this guy named Robert Hare, right? He studies psychopaths. He looks at psychopathy. He looks at what they kind of entail, right? And the overall conclusion here is that not all criminals are psychopaths, and not all psychopaths are criminals. Psychopathy is just a name for a certain cluster of personality traits, right? They're usually charming. They can, they get along well with other people, but they don't really have much of a conscience. They don't have a lot of empathy. If they were to hurt somebody or, either physically or emotionally or whatever, they really wouldn't care that much. They might have been socially trained to act like they're caring sometimes if they need something or if it helps them, but they don't really have the normal conscience that you or I hopefully do, right? And it's just associated kind of personality traits, as we talked about on the previous slide, that this idea of psychopath really measures. It's a certain collection of those being high or low in these certain different personality traits that we've applied this label of psychopath to. And again, not all psychopaths are criminals, and not all criminals are psychopaths. They just have a tendency to become, much more likely to become criminal than non-psychopaths. And again, we run into this problem of tautology in testing. Because most of the measures of whether somebody's a psychopath or not have to do with their criminal behaviors. And thus, we're measuring our independent variable using the same measure as our dependent variable, just as we talked about on the previous slide. So some of this, there seems to be some good evidence that this concept of psychopath really is useful, and there really are people out there that have these collections of personality traits that is accurately called being a psychopath, and they really do seem to have some increased criminality. But especially the early measures of whether somebody was a psychopath or not used criminal or deviant actions to determine whether they were a psychopath, and thus, of course, they had more criminal or deviant actions at the end. That's what we were measuring at the beginning. So they've had to develop new measures of psychopathy that don't include those criminal actions as part of the measure or diagnosis for being a psychopath. And those took a while, but they do, even using those more modern measures of psychopathy that don't just measure the dependent variable, there does seem to be a connection between psychopathy and criminality. So psychopaths are much more likely to be versatile as criminals. In other words, they're less likely to specialize in one crime or one type of crime. They seem to be more likely than other criminals to kind of spread out their criminal career and commit lots of different kinds of crime. They're also more likely to become life course persistent offenders rather than just adolescent or juvenile isolated offenders. We'll talk much more about this in a later section. But in other words, their criminality is much more likely to last until they are much older. Whereas most criminals, they commit a lot of crime when they're young and then the crime drops off as they get older. Psychopaths, not so much. And then they're much more likely to be violent. Right? Non-psychopaths gravitate more towards things like property crime, whereas psychopaths gravitate more towards things like violent crime. And again, it's nowhere near 100%. We're not saying all psychopaths are violent criminals or all violent criminals are psychopaths. Just slightly different rates of offending in these specific areas. There are these specific different kinds of outcomes that we find with people who have the personality traits that meet this definition or this pattern that we have dubbed being a psychopath. All right, we're going to go ahead and take a break. Thank you so much for watching.